And then,
well, that said,
you know, you have, there's a lot of ways to
go. Yeah, that's great.
All right. Well, welcome, benvenuti a tutti. Good evening. We're really so happy to have Olivia K. Chiron here in conversation with Anthony Marra, though I heard her call him Tony, so I'm not sure.
Tony amongst friends.
Tony. And it's very exciting for us. We're co-sponsoring this with I Am Books tonight. So the format, if you're used to our Saturday night format, it's a little bit different tonight. We're focused on Anthony Marra's novel tonight. And I just wanted to say a few things. There are some flyers on the chairs. I'm on the board of the Italian American Writers Association. My name's Julia Lasella, and I'm also the co-host and co-curator of our Iowa readings here every third Saturday, except for December. But we have our special event that's close to December. And that's what I'm doing here, just letting you know about our organization. And to tell you a few things about the benefits of joining Iowa, if you're interested. The organization was founded about 30 years ago. It was very active in New York until a few upstarts from Boston decided to have Iowa here as well. So we've been doing that for almost 7 years with my co-curator, Jennifer Martelli. And we ask you to think about joining and supporting other writers of Italian descent. That's our mission. We have 3 mottos, which are read one another, buy each other's books, and write or be written. Don't wait for other people to tell you what the Italian American experience is or what your own experience is, but write your own story. We're really grateful to Nicola, the owner of the bookstore, and Chiara, who's here, and Eleni, our store manager, for making this all happen. So thank you, Chiara. And really, you're in for a treat with these 2 writers. I just wanted to introduce Olivia because Olivia is going to introduce Anthony, and I thought you should know a little bit about Olivia. She's not only a dedicated writing teacher. Anthony will be in her class tomorrow, and the class's title I love is called Socially Conscious Storytellers, her writing class at Suffolk University. But she's also a novelist in her own right. She's the author of The Hunger Saint, which is a gorgeous novella about the sulfur mines of Sicily post-World War II. It's a fabulous book. You may be able to find it on our Italian American featured writers bookshelf there. Her writings appeared in the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, the Christian Science Monitor, and so many more. She's the winner of the Jack Dyer Fiction Prize. And she's currently working on a novel called Displaced, which we've had the pleasure of hearing parts of, both as a featured writer, and then our featured writers come to our open mics, which I think really says a lot about our open mics, that we've gotten to hear lots of parts of the novel, and it's quite exciting. So anyway, Olivia has a whole program in store for you, and so I'm going to leave it up to you guys. Thank you.
thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Julia, and to the Italian American Writers Association and to I Am Books for hosting tonight's reading conversation with Anthony Marra to discuss Mercury Pictures Presents, and thank you to all of you who are here with us. I am so thrilled to introduce Anthony Marra, whose work the Washington Post has described as a flash in the heavens that makes you look up and believe in miracles. His previous books, the New York Times bestselling A Constellation of Vital Phenomena and The Tsar of Love and Techno, have received international acclaim for their brilliant, sweeping, and exquisitely rendered prose that examines the human cost of war and enduring love and redemption. Marra's work has been honored with the National Book Critics Circle's John Leonard Prize, the Anisfield Wolf Book Award, the National Magazine Award, and a Guggenheim Fellowship, among many other accolades. Long listed for the National Book Award A constellation of vital phenomena weaves together the lives of those navigating the brutality of the Chechen civil wars of the late 90s and 2004. A spellbinding, intricately crafted tale layered in unimaginable traumas that highlights the tender presence of humanity and hope in the face of unrelenting suffering. Though set in the vastly different time and place of World War II era Hollywood, his latest novel, Mercury Pictures Presents, is equally as powerful and mesmerizing, portraying a wide and varied cast of haunting characters drawn into contact by war and its treacheries, and their work at Mercury Pictures, a B-movie studio which has become a nexus for refugees and political exiles seeking sanctuary, employment, and a second chance in remaking their lives and identities fractured by loss and displacement. At the forefront of an expansive cast emerges Maria Lagana, an Italian immigrant and young associate producer serving as the right-hand man of her boss, Artie Feldman, who is desperate to keep the studio afloat despite looming financial ruin and congressional hearings by isolationist senators on accusations of propaganda through film. As the world descends further into war, Maria is greeted by the arrival of a stranger who forces her to reckon with a past she'd outrun with her mother from Mussolini's fascist Italy, after unwittingly playing a role as a child in her father's arrest and sentenced to internal exile in the Confino colony of San Lorenzo, Calabria. Named one of the best books of the year by NPR, The Guardian, Book List, Mercury Pictures Presents was also named an Editor's Choice Award by the New York Times, who described it as a gorgeous book. Marra's sublime dexterity brings these worlds into a natural seeming alignment. Knit together, these pieces have striking command and authority. The Los Angeles Times remarked how right and proper for a novel concerning World War II era Italian fascism to highlight how easy it is for all of us to fall prey to false romantic narratives, underscoring the ever-chilling timeliness of this novel's place in our own contemporary political landscape. I am so thrilled to present to you Anthony Marra.
Thank you so much. This is an absolute treat to be with you today. It's such a treat to finally meet you in person. My wife Cappy is an art historian who went to Sicily this fall to research this project on the role that Sicilian sulfur played in the photographic industry. And your first book was one on her nightstand, and one that has brought great insight and joy to us both. So it's just a real honor to be here with you, and thank you all for coming out tonight. Thank you for sponsoring this. I'm particularly pleased to be back in the Boston area, because this is where I ended up writing much of this novel. I moved here from California with my wife in 2019. She had a job. She got a job at the Harvard Art Museums, and so we sold our car, thinking, we didn't want to deal with the winter. We got an apartment directly across the street from the Harvard Art Museums, and we moved in fall 2019. And we could see my wife's office from our apartment, which is where we both worked for all of COVID. Anyway, when we moved here, I'd been working on this book for a couple of years, and was sort of struggling to find my way into it. I had all of these sections set in LA and all these sections set in Italy, and trying to figure out how I was going to bring these two worlds together had given me a lot of trouble. More than the specific sort of plotting, I wasn't able to find the right tone. I was struggling with finding a voice to really bring just this world to life. So at the beginning of the pandemic, I was working in Cambridge, I had this office in our apartment that was built out of an old closet. Sort of, we had all of these closets. The refrigerator was in a closet, and I found a closet that was just wide enough for me to sort of cram in a children's school sized desk, and that was my office. For weeks leading up to months, I should say, leading up to the onset of the pandemic, I'd walk by my office and sort of peer in and say, "Not today," and carry on my way. And then with the beginning of the pandemic, suddenly the manuscript, the blank page, was the only way that I could leave the apartment. The kind of that sense of being transported, that sense of getting outside of the confines of your life through literature, through art, became just really evident to me. And all of a sudden, I found myself going back to my office every day and actually looking forward to getting to work. And I noticed that during that period, not only did the book just seem to come to life, but I felt like I finally landed on the right voice, the right tone. And it was almost as if as the world outside was getting grimmer and grimmer, I kind of felt like I had to create something that would offer a little ballast to that. And I felt like the humor in the book was becoming more pronounced. And so I ended up printing out a chunk, my first sort of pandemic chunk, and giving it to my wife to read. And I hid in one of the other closets because there's nothing as uncomfortable as trying to decipher the facial expressions of a loved one as they read your work. And all of a sudden, as I was sort of hiding in this one of the other closets, I could hear her laughing through the wall, and that was sort of the moment where I realized I kind of had my voice for this book, that I wanted this to be something that would kind of carry laughter through the wall. So I'm gonna just read the first little bit of this, and then we will chat away.
Yeah.
All right. So this is, I don't think there's any setup required. You did an absolutely fantastic job of giving the context of this. This is just from the beginning. When you entered the executive offices of Mercury Pictures International, you would first see a scale model of the studio itself. Artie Feldman, co-founder and head of production, installed it in the lobby to distract skittish investors from second thoughts. Complete with backlot, sound stages, and facilities buildings, the miniature was a faithful replica of the 10-acre studio in which it sat. Maria Lagana, as rendered by the miniaturist, was a tiny, featureless figure looking out Artie's office window. And this is where the real Maria was looking, where the real Maria stood late one morning in 1941, hands holstered on her hips, watching a pigeon autograph the windshield of her boss's new convertible. She would like to buy that bird a drink. It's a beautiful day out, Art, Maria said. You really should come, have a look. I have, Artie said. It made me want to jump. Artie wasn't known for his joie de vivre, but he usually didn't fantasize about ending it all this close to lunch. Maria wondered if the Senate investigation into motion picture war propaganda was giving him agita. But no, the crisis at hand was on his head. His bald spot had finally grown too large for his toupee to conceal. 6 other black toupees were shellacked atop wooden mannequin heads on the shelf behind his desk, where a more successful producer might display his Oscars. They were conversation starters, as in Artie began conversations with new employees by telling them the toupees were the scalps of their predecessors. As far as Maria could tell, the 6 hairpieces were the same indistinguishable model and style. But Artie had become convinced that each one crackled with the karmic energy of the hair's original head, unrealized and awaiting release, like a static charge smuggled in a fingertip. Thus, he named his toupees after their personalities: the heavyweight, the Casanova, the optimist, the Edison, the Odysseus, and the Mephistopheles. Artie had never felt more at home in his adoptive country than when he learned the founding fathers had all worn toupees, even that showboat, John Hancock. The only one who hadn't was Benjamin Franklin. Look how he turned out. A syphilitic Francophile who got his jollies flying kites in the rain. I read that line in Philadelphia. It did not go over well. Maybe we'll jump into conversation.
Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much, Anthony. And it's interesting. This first section of the book that you read from is titled "Sunny Siberia," and I think that speaks so well. I'm so interested in hearing about the origins of Mercury Pictures Presents, especially since it focuses on what made you want to focus on such a historically tumultuous time period, 1930s, 40s. We had so many refugees and political exiles coming into America, and really coming into this narrative landscape of exile, right? Where Sunny Siberia is one of the characters greets a new employee of Mercury Pictures. Welcome to Sunny Siberia. And I just thought that phrase so perfectly captures what a lot of individuals were feeling. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. It in fact was the original title for this book was Sunny Siberia. And my previous two books were actually set in Russia, and so we decided it might confuse things to call this Sunny Siberia. But Sunny Siberia was a term that many exiles in Los Angeles used to describe Southern California. Frank Lloyd Wright once said that if you tip the world on its side, all the loose pieces will land in the land. And this was probably never more true than it was in the 30s and 40s, where tens of thousands of European refugees were landing in LA, and it was this really seismic cultural transfusion in the history of California, where you had Thomas Mann was writing Dr. Faustus in the Pacific Palisades. You had film noir as a film style was created by this influx of European filmmakers sort of engaging with hard-boiled American pulp. In terms of sort of like the intellectual climate in Southern California in general, which had long been sort of looked down upon by folks on the East Coast. Now they could point to sort of all of these heavy hitters in their midst. And yet, for obvious reasons, it wasn't home. And so this idea of this this beautiful but nonetheless still very emotionally conflicted place became referred to as Sunny Siberia. Anyway, so I used to live in LA. My wife's family is from there, and this period had always really interested me. And so after I finished my second book, I was sort of casting around for possible ideas, and I kept coming back to LA in this period and sort of the broader exile community that was living there. At the same time, I was also thinking about something in southern Italy in the early decades of the 20th century. I was interested in sort of looking at the period of mass migration from Italy, and my dad's side of the family is from there, and it just seemed like a fascinating time and place. So I was sort of bouncing back and forth between these two ideas, and things kind of came together finally when when my wife and I took just a vacation to Lipari, which is one of the Aeolian Islands off the coast, the northeastern coast of Sicily, which is where my great grandmother emigrated from. And we were walking around as this sort of absolutely, postcard perfect little island. And we were walking around, and we noticed on one of the walls in sort of the old town, there was this plaque that had been put up memorializing the various anti-fascists and intellectuals and artists who had been sentenced to terms of confino on Lipari. And I just remember it feeling incredibly surreal that this island paradise to which I could trace my roots had been Mussolini's Alcatraz. And just looking around, it occurred to me that the term sunny Siberia could fit this island as well as it could Los Angeles. And it was sort of at that moment I realized that I wasn't working on two separate books, but rather halves of the same book, and that it would tell the story of these two sunny Siberias on either side of the world, and this one family divided between them.
That's incredible. And it's well, what's so wonderful about this book is just the layers of displacement and trauma that kind of build into these characters, their identities and their families. And specifically, we think about Maria Lagana. So many of these characters' narratives are stories of life under fascism, right? And thinking about, I was really interested in how you came to her character and her parents, Giuseppe and Annunziata. Thinking about, like, there's this wonderful interview you gave with Book Page, and you said that totalitarian ideology invariably undermines the family as an institution by turning each member into a potential betrayer. And we know how that tragically plays out with Maria as a child, unwittingly playing a role in her father's arrest, right? Her father, Giuseppe, he's a lawyer. He finds himself at odds with Mussolini's regime. And their stories, and of course, layered in with the his story of being in the Confino and Calabria. How did you come to conceiving of her character and their characters specifically?
Yeah, I've so when after I wrote my first book, my dad said, I noticed that the fathers don't come off very well in your work. And so in this one, I actually did. I set out to write a novel where the mother is the villain instead. And there is this sort of very very moving relationship between Maria and her father. I think that for me, I've always been interested in the way that politics sort of touch down and transform our most intimate and private relationships. In my earlier works, this was focused largely in the Soviet Union and sort of looking at how particularly under Stalinism, the family sort of became this zone of potential betrayers, and you had to censor yourself around your children because they might very well blurt out to the teacher some stray remark and get not only you but get them in trouble as well. And so thinking of how relationships become mediated through this external force. Mussolini couldn't be more further away, sort of existentially, from the lives of these characters, and yet the influence of the politics that he propagates deeply affects how they relate with one another, and how they try to care and love each other despite sort of everything. Maria, sort of growing up between, she ends up immigrating with her mother, after her father is arrested, and she sort of grows up between these two countries, and she just seemed like someone who I have many aunts, and they're all they were just like the main figures sort of in my childhood, and in many ways I was just trying to think of what they were like. They would have been roughly Maria's age, my great aunts, and I sort of tried to essentially write them as they might have been.
Yeah, you do such a wonderful job. You're talking earlier about humor and the use of humor, and I love the banter between the great aunts, because we know there's such heaviness that has again been layered into this immigrant community, and yet there's the playfulness and the banter. There's definitely a definite sense of warmth that you execute so well. And to that effect, I did want to talk about how you rendered the Italian American community of Lincoln Heights, Los Angeles. There's such nuance and depth, and it's so interesting how this plays into when the issue of Italian Americans are labeled as enemy aliens. And so maybe we can take this in two parts, like how you approached conceiving of that community in Lincoln Heights, and then the enemy alien.
Absolutely. Well, so the Los Angeles, never had Italian American communities to the same extent that you have in Boston or New York or Baltimore or Cleveland, but there was quite a sizable community for the West Coast. There was in total, I believe it was near 100,000 Italian Americans at its peak, and Lincoln Heights was one of the main sort of centers for the Italian diaspora in Los Angeles. There were 2 Italian language newspapers. There was a very involved community center in Lincoln Heights. There was sort of these networks that spread throughout Southern California and throughout Greater Los Angeles. Today, that's largely, it has largely been effaced. There's a wonderful Italian American Museum of Los Angeles that opened a couple of years ago that is actively trying to sort of resurrect some of this history, but Los Angeles is not a place where history necessarily lasts in its most visible state for long. And the actual geography of LA, the fact that these Italian American neighborhoods stretched out from San Pedro in sort of the southwestern sort of section of Los Angeles County to Lincoln Heights, that's 20 or 30 miles. So the actual physical distances between these neighborhoods meant that it was very easy for them to sort of get whittled away and gradually sort of disperse following the war. But Lincoln Heights was one of the main ones, and I just found myself sort of fascinated with the idea of this chapter in the Italian American experience that I hadn't really known much. I didn't know much about. I don't really associate Los Angeles with Italian American history, and it seemed like a way to explore the history of Italians in America through this slightly circuitous route, which I guess sort of brings us to one of the main reasons why I chose LA and Lincoln Heights to explore the Italian American experience, and that's because LA was one of was the largest center of Italians in California, and in World War II, many of these individuals were labeled enemy aliens.
Mhm. Which I have to say, I so admired the blackout section, which goes into so much detail about not only how this community is affected, right? Right after 1941, when Italy declared war on, the U.S. government started to take these domestic actions. Certainly the internment of Japanese Americans, how Hollywood was involved in promoting these very racist, stereotypical anti-Asian views, right, through film. But the also labeling and targeting of Italian American communities and labeling them as enemy aliens and subjecting them to very difficult restrictions. We know Maria Lagana is not allowed to even see her family. She can't see her mother. She can't visit Lincoln Heights. She lives in a different part of Los Angeles, and she's just far enough where the restrictions say you can't go this far because you're an enemy alien. Not to mention, folks not being able to use cameras and the loss of jobs in Hollywood and all of that. But I thought it was so significant because you don't hear that talked about in mainstream portrayals of Italian Americana. The fact that this was a very real experience historically that Italian Americans went through. And it's something that I think deserves greater attention. And so I'm just so intrigued on how you approach that material, the research, or how you got into the psychology, because I can only imagine coming from, especially like Maria and her mother, coming from fascist Italy, and then being subjected to, the oppression, the restrictions of your new government.
So the first time that I had ever heard about this, I see Una Storia Segreta right over there. That was one of the books that I consulted frequently. It's sort of a collection of oral history of this period in California. I first heard about sort of the Italians being targeted from the neighbor of my in-laws. This was I don't know, maybe 8 or 9 years ago, and she said that her father had been interned, that he was an Italian national. And he had been interned for a couple of years, and he was at a camp, at an internment camp with other Italians and also some Germans. And she said that her earliest childhood memory was going up to visit him. That she and her mom, got passes to visit him on Saturday or Sunday, and her earliest memory was seeing the Germans and the Italians playing volleyball against each other. And this was, this was something I'd never heard of before. And I called my dad, and he grew up in Brooklyn, and his whole family was there at the time, and I asked if did anything like this happen in New York, and he had no idea what I was talking about, and it just seemed amazing that this was a West Coast phenomenon. It was because California, Oregon, and Washington State were all considered part of the theater of war, of the Pacific, the Pacific War, and so due to that sort of classification, these systems of sort of extra legal curtailing of civil rights were implemented on the West Coast as they weren't on the East Coast. But it just seemed incredible that this really important and horrific curtailing of civil rights had been so elided in my own understanding of Italian American history, and so probably the most famous example of this was Joe DiMaggio's parents. They were going to be evacuated, as the as the euphemism put it, from San Francisco piers where they lived and worked, and because Joe DiMaggio was in the midst of was the most famous baseball player in the country, they sort of got an exception, yeah, this was something that touched many lives in California and Washington.
Incredible. And again, so I think so important too that this history is talked about, integrated in new ways too, and kind of thought about. It's interesting how these things play out in Maria's experiences. There's so many fantastic characters that you bring to light, but I feel like that she, in some ways, this whole idea of being seen, not seen, this sense of self-censorship. Censorship is such a, as you mentioned, such a prevalent theme in a lot of your books, and certainly this book is no exception. And I thought like the relationship between Maria and Eddie was so tender and so beautiful. So Eddie Liu is this beautiful, brilliant Chinese American actor who, in order to work in Hollywood at the time, so many Asian American actors were forced to portray these very racist, anti-Asian, stereotypical characters. And of course, as the war gone on, more Japanese characters, right, to vilify them as part of this propaganda effort. And Maria and Eddie come together and have this beautiful relationship. And even though there are these racist laws at the time that prohibit interracial marriage, they are able to come together and like form a home with one another, where they're able to really see one another. I felt like they really saw one another because they're both dealing with their own layers of trauma and discrimination, right, in very different ways. And I sense that like there were times where Maria didn't feel seen by her Italian American family, right? Even though there's a sense of warmth and fun with her aunts, but they're always asking, well, when are you going to get married? When are you going to settle down? Are you going to marry, a nice Italian boy? All of these things. But with Eddie and Maria, there was this sense of kinship. And I couldn't help but wonder what inspired, their relationship, and how you brought their relationship, their intimacy to life on the page.
Yeah,
such a beautiful dimension of the book.
Oh well, thank you so much. So I've always really struggled with writing love stories. I've never just felt very competent with those narratives, and this is absolutely the love story in all my work that I'm proudest of. I think it's probably my favorite relationship in the book. These, as you put it so beautifully, I think these two characters who are so different in the particulars of their experiences. That Maria is someone who literally has traveled halfway around the world, has been living in exile for the majority of her life. And Eddie is someone who is a third generation Chinese American Angelino who has never left Los Angeles County, whose life is so rooted to this place that he doesn't even own a suitcase. Whereas Maria has spent much of her life literally living out of the suitcase. How these two people sort of recognize aspects in one another's lives that they admire, that they want for themselves, but also that they see very much reflecting what they've been through. And I think that both of these characters particularly sort of really see how Hollywood as a business is very challenging for people who are on the margins in any sort of sense of that. And certainly Maria as a immigrant, as a woman working in Hollywood at this time is very much sort of on the edges of any room she's in, and certainly Eddie is as well, as an actor.
I can't help but bring up a constellation of vital phenomenon, which is such a breathtaking book. And I felt like these books, even though they're so different, really spoke to one another, both structurally and thematically. you know, especially in Constellation of Vital Phenomenon, there's this consistent theme of loss and displacement and being disappeared, and loved ones never really knowing at times the fates of what happens to people that they've been separated by because of war. And so, like, psychologically, you know, were there things when you were putting Mercury Pictures, you know, Presents together, that you thought about, that you had learned through A Constellation of Vital Phenomenon, in terms of how to approach the psychology of these characters who are navigating such extreme traumas and grief? You know, I think about Annunziata, right, who her life has been layered by grief. You know, she survives the earthquake in Calabria and the loss of her husband, and then coming to Los Angeles and never really feeling like she can really well integrate as an immigrant, right?
Mhm.
She's bounded by you know, the loss of her husband, and not really being able to grasp English. And I thought it was really beautiful how she carries the suitcase full of soil from Rome, from the graves that she had hoped to be buried, and, you know, her husband and whatnot, as some kind of reminder, or rooting herself to some sense of home. How did you approach the psychology of these characters dealing with grief and loss, and if there was anything you learned or thought about with you know, A Constellation of Vital Phenomena?
Yeah, that's such a wonderful question. I think that throughout, my first book, Constellation, was set in Chechnya, and when I was working on that, you know, the early drafts of that book were very sort of serious and very somber, and everything was kind of you know, this very sort of narrow, kind of miserable band of emotion. As I was researching that book, and as I was chatting with folks from there, as I you know, traveled through Chechnya, I realized that you know, that very narrow slice of sort of the emotional range that those early drafts were hitting were just not at all capturing the diversity of and sort of just the wide range of emotional reactions to sort of any traumatic event. And I think that that sort of the darker a book is, the lighter it needs to be as well. That you really need to you know, play both ends of the keyboard. And so with this this book, which, you know, is not as dark as that first one, but does certainly have you know, its share of moments of you know, of trauma and heartache that shapes these characters. I really did feel that there needed to be at all moments this sort of countervailing force, and part of that, I think, is just as a reader, you need those moments of release, but I also think that to sort of deny your characters the complexity of you know, being able to you know, laugh as they're walking past the graveyard would be to deny them something, you know, essential and human. So I did I feel like it, like the mistakes I made in the early drafts of the first book did feel like a way of maybe circumventing you know, mistakes that I might have been might have otherwise made in this.
And you do with both books, you really do such an incredible job with your use of dialogue, right? There's this very sharp, witty, humorous, you know, it really breathes life into the characters. And I think that's one of the pleasures of reading your fiction. And I think structurally too, I can't help but ask, because both of these books, A Constellation of Vital Phenomenon and Mercury Pictures Presents, have these incredibly intricate, so well-crafted, intersecting storylines and backstories that are at times non-linear, but they all perfectly add up in these very essential and very propulsive capacities, right? We're always kind of pushing the narrative forward, but weaving together all of these very different lives and traumas. So, I can't help but ask how you conceived of the narrative structure of Mercury Pictures Presents, and what maybe you learned from, again, like, constellation of vital phenomenon, and if you had any particular challenges in conceiving of that narrative container for Mercury Pictures Presents, and how you were able to drive forward all these moving pieces and have it all add up so perfectly at the end.
Yeah, well, it's a lot of trial and error, I suppose. I'm a big believer in using research as a way of structuring your work. So fairly early on in researching this book, like the first kind of fact that I came across that really made me sit up was this story about one of Billy Wilder's mentors, this director by the name of Joe May. Joe May and his wife fled Berlin, and in the late 30s. And at the time, if you were leaving Germany, and particularly if you were Jewish, you could only take a certain amount of money with you. I can't remember what the figure was, but it was quite a lot. And so Joe May's wife, she realized that a number of her friends in Berlin had tortoise shells that they decorated with costume jewelry, with rhinestones and stuff. That this was a fashionable thing at the time. So she decided that she was going to take all of her and Joe's money and convert it into diamonds, and simply put the diamonds amongst the rhinestones on her pet tortoise. And this was how she got her money out of Germany. And so for years, I just had in my mind, the book needs to be big enough to have this tortoise somewhere. And so, you kind of like you get a number of those different tortoises, and you begin to see, well, how can I get from this to that? How can I? It's almost like you're island hopping with these little facts and little anecdotes that bring the world alive to you. And that was the case with Constellation. Was I sort of had the equivalent of these turtles that I was moving through, and that was the case with this as well. And I feel like at some level you just feel like there's a sense of, there must be a way I can figure out how to get this turtle in in this book. And so eventually the turtles you can't sort of figure out how to get to, you dispense with, but those you can sort of create the structure.
Wonderful. Well, we're gonna open it up to questions from the audience soon. But I do want to end with this, and thank you again so much, Anthony, for all the time you've taken with us tonight. You've mentioned before in interviews of your interest in creating books in conversation with one another, such as Constellation Vital Phenomenon, and of course your wonderful story collection, Czar of Love and Techno. And I can't help but wonder if you have another book in the works, or maybe an idea percolating that might allow readers to, again, think about or dip into the world and the characters of Mercury Pictures Presents.
Yeah, so I'm working on a new book now. It doesn't involve these characters or Hollywood or Los Angeles, but it is another book. It's told from the perspective of an Italian American, sort of looking back on her life, particularly the 1940s and 50s, from the perspective of the mid 2000s. So it's sort of another one of those that I feel like can sit comfortably next to it on the bookshelf.
Wonderful. And I think that's so rich that you're also returning again to the Italian Americana. There's a lot to be mined there. Wonderful. Okay, so before Anthony signs books, if other questions or anything, anyone?
Thanks for writing these. I've loved both Constellation and Mercury Pictures.
Oh, thank you so
Fabulous
much.
books.
Thank you.
When does the movie come out?
That's what I was,
Yeah.
I was thinking the same thing.
We'll see. We will see. Hopefully soon.
It's exciting.
When do you know when your research is done? Like, you know, do you get to a point where I gotta really start writing, or are you always writing the fiction while you're
Yeah. So
researching?
it's like I almost feel like writing is just becomes the excuse for researching. Like research is always the it perceives and it outlives the
Yeah.
the actual writing process. So I always I sort of see research and writing as this sort of feedback system where you're working on something in the morning and you're like, well, I should check this, that, or the other, and that sort of leads you down a little rabbit hole, and that changes how you're working on that one chapter, but something you gleaned in that sort of sets up some terminals for down the road. So there were things that I didn't. There's this whole section set in Utah, wherein a couple of characters in here are working on this project to this actual historical project to create a sort of model of a life-size model of a Berlin neighborhood in the middle of Utah for weapons testing. And I only sort of stumbled into this after years of working on the book, and all of a sudden, like, this was the biggest of my turtles, where I had to reconfigure the entire book to figure out where and how this could be, something that it leads to one of the places where it goes. So yeah, it's constantly. I feel like what you discover as you write determines what you research, and what you then discover in the research changes your approach to the writing.
It's so different as a poet. I'm just sort of marveling at the structure that it takes for you guys to do what you do. And you've both traveled for your research, and we had Juliet Grames here, who does a lot of travel for her novels. And do you always know this is for both of you, really, do you always know what you're looking for when you're traveling,
Well, I definitely think that when you have the privilege and the luxury of being in the place, there is something that the sense of place gives you as a writer, right? In an intimate sense of how you connect the characters to that sense of place. I certainly experienced that when I was writing The Hunger Saint, and I was very lucky to travel to Voganera Cairo Pepi in Sicily, which was the site of the sulfur mines, where they had children as young as 5 and 6 years old who were Carusi and were working. It was a type of indentured servitude. So being in that place, even though it's not been used as a mine, as a sulfur mine for many decades, there is a kind of haunted sense of there's a resonance there, and there are people in the community and their memories. I do a lot of oral histories. I think oral histories are so important to kind of gather because it really feeds your imagination and subconsciously what you're going to pull from as a fiction writer. But I think that it's important, and what I so appreciate about Anthony, from you, and learning from you tonight, is that having that kind of fluidity and that flexibility as you're allowing the novel to evolve into the structure and into the format it's meant to be, because of the research you're doing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. Yeah, I'm a big believer that just being open to that keeping an open mind in all things, no matter what your walk of life is always a good idea. But I think it's particularly important, at least for me, in writing, and just because there's so much that you just don't know about your project at any moment. And I feel like over time I've definitely become more and more of a believer that that the book is kind of guiding you and tapping you on the shoulder and pointing you, you know, maybe you want to check this out over here. And the more that you just sort of trust the process and you know, allow yourself to be surprised, then hopefully the reader will be surprised and would like it too.
Where did you do your research? Like, what were like the key places that you went or sources that you consulted?
Yeah, so I went to I spent a lot of time in LA, a lot of time just driving around the city. The majority of the book though came from, you know, the library. I spent you know, a small fortune on on various history books and you know, out of print this and you know, watched a ton of movies. One of the great things about writing a novel set in this time period is you can watch old movies on, you know, a Tuesday morning and call it work. But I did you know, spend time in Sicily and in Calabria working on this as well. And one of the sort of the most kind of moving aspects of it was you know, visiting the visiting relatives who I'd never met in Italy and in Calabria, who took me around, and you know, this little village where, you know, there were more Marras, you know, there's one place that I never met before, and so yeah, it was I tend to usually try to keep pretty a good deal of distance between sort of my own life and my personal life and what I write. And this was the first book where I really felt that collapse in quite a bit, and more of my you know, my own family's stories and all of that really came through.
Yes.
Hi. Now, when I read a book that is very memorable to me, that it stays with me and changes me in some way. This book for you, do you feel that it changed you in some way?
Oh, that's a great, a beautiful question. I absolutely think it did. I particularly when and how I finished it. You know, this was I remember after my wife Kathy commented that she thought of everything I've written, this one sounded the most like me. And I think that that oftentimes, you know, as a writer, you're sort of trying to you're gradually trying to get more and more into a voice, into a tone, into a sort of style that is more completely, you know, and fully you. And I think that maybe with this book, I got, you know, closer than in the past. So in that sense, I certainly think it changed my relationship to my own work.
Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you. Thank you.
If you're the cash register may be closing soon, so if you'd like to buy books, you should buy them right now. So that Anthony can sign. And if you haven't been on our mailing list and you would like to be, please sign that. Good night.